Okay, the lesson today is going to be about parts of the cell. Some of you have been asking me about what an organelle is, or what really is the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So this lesson is going to teach you all about what's going on inside those cells we've been learning about. So let's start with a typical cell such as this. This is a plant cell, and you can see that within this cell there are some different parts, and they have different shapes, and in this particular diagram different colors, and they have all of these different names. We're going to talk about some of these, and you're going to learn some of these parts and what exactly they're doing inside the cell. So if we zoom in on this plant cell, we see at the outer edges of the cell something called a cell wall. Now these are only seen in plant cells, and some bacteria, and what cell walls are doing are giving the cell structure. They hold it together. When you think about plants standing up straight, they don't have a skeleton. It's the cell wall that allows them to stand up straight. It gives them structure. Cell walls are made of cellulose. Just beyond that, inside the cell wall, is something called the cell membrane. Cell membranes are sometimes also called plasma membranes. Okay, the cell membrane is going to decide for that cell what is allowed to cross and what is not allowed to cross into the cell and out of the cell. The cell membrane is kind of like the door or the gate. It's determining what can go in and what can go out. This next label, the cytoplasm, also known as the cytosol, is a soup of stuff that's inside the cell. It has proteins, it has other molecules floating around, enzymes, but it's the soup that makes up the cell. Something else you see only in plant cells is this structure known as the chloroplast. In this diagram it's green. It's usually seen as green. Sometimes you see little structures within the chloroplast, but the job of the chloroplast is to do photosynthesis. It's going to be providing the energy for the cell, and this of course is going to be only seen in plants as well. Only plants have chloroplasts. So this organelle known as the chloroplast can take in the sun's energy and convert it to food for the cell. Another structure we see only in plant cells is a vacuole. So this is only in plants. And this particular vacuole, you'll see it takes up a good deal of space within the cell. In most plant cells, this vacuole will take up half the cell or sometimes more. And what's inside there is water. So this is a storage place for water within the cell itself, and it is a place where plants can actually store up water. It also gives the plant cell some structure because, of course, it's filled with water, and it gives it that sort of rigid structure that water can provide. Animal cells, the cells in your body, do not have a large vacuole like that. They might have a smaller vacuole. Now, this is a diagram of an animal cell. Notice it looks different. There are going to be some structures that are the same, though, in both kinds of cells, and we're going to talk about some of those right now. If we zoom in on the animal cell, the first structure, the first organelle you might notice is this thing called a mitochondrion, or mitochondria sometimes. And the mitochondrion is in plant cells also, and it's also in animal cells. And the mitochondrion, we call it the powerhouse. It provides the energy for the cell. Without a mitochondria, the cell will die because it needs that energy. So it's the mitochondria that get the energy, break it down, and make it available to the cell for the cell to do all the activities it needs to do. Both plant and animal cells also have something called a nucleus. Very important. It contains the instructions for everything that the cell needs to be doing. It has the DNA in it, in the form of chromosomes, and it's contained within its own membrane. So you have the cell membrane, you also have this membrane around the nucleus. Also, there's a membrane around the mitochondria, which I didn't mention. But within the nucleus itself is something called the nucleolus. The nucleolus makes these things called ribosomes, which are really important. But as you can see, the nucleus, it doesn't have to be in the center of the cell, and it's usually very visible. We'll be looking at some under the microscope, I'm sure. But the importance of the nucleus is that it has the DNA and it contains the instructions. Usually found next to the nucleus is this stuff called rough ER. ER stands for endoplasmic, this is a crazy word, reticulum. You don't have to know that. You have to know ER. But the rough ER processes proteins. So we talked about proteins. Proteins are made in cells in the endoplasmic reticulum. Very important for processing of proteins. Specifically, the proteins are made on these things called ribosomes, which are the little red dots that you see here, the little red dots. The ribosomes are the protein factories. They make the proteins, and then it's in the rough ER that the proteins are processed. Think of it like someone made a sandwich and it needs to go in a bag so you can take it with you. Or someone made some cookies, they need to be packaged up so that they can be sold, something like that. Very important. You also see in this part of the picture something called a peroxisome. Peroxisomes have actually hydrogen peroxide, which you may be familiar with from our enzyme lab. And peroxisomes break down wastes. You ever wonder what cells do with their wastes? They make them. They have to get rid of them. Peroxisomes are digestive sacs that break down wastes. Now, those structures that I've been talking about are found both in plant and animal cells. I want to make sure you understand that. Rough ER and ribosomes and the nucleus are found in both plant and animal cells. Another structure I do want to talk about that's in both kinds of cells is the Golgi apparatus, sometimes called the Golgi body, and it's in the Golgi apparatus that the final processing of proteins occurs. So think of it like the cookies that we packaged up, and the ribosomes make the cookies, the ER packages the cookies, and it's the Golgi apparatus that puts them in the box and puts them on the truck that goes out to the store. So it's the final processing of proteins occurring in the Golgi apparatus. And you can see that it's made of membrane here, and there's actually pieces of membrane being pinched off and forming these little things called vesicles. And the vesicles are like the boxes of cookies, and they're going to go out to the membrane sometimes and be pushed out of the cell. Okay, also in both plant and animal cells we see something called smooth ER. Again, ER standing for endoplasmic reticulum. And smooth ER is a little bit different from rough ER. It doesn't have ribosomes on it, so it's not making proteins. Instead, it's making lipids. Okay, so it's processing lipids. And you know what lipids are. They're fats and oils. So here's our whole animal cell again, and we've talked about most of these structures, most of these organelles. Remember, all of this is also seen in plant cells, and the difference is plant cells have the chloroplast, the cell wall, and the large water vacuole. Everything else is the same for the cells. Now, what we've been talking about so far is just for eukaryotic cells. I want you to notice now the difference between those cells and this one, which is a prokaryotic cell. This is a bacteria. And notice how different it is. It does not have all of those complicated parts, like no mitochondria, no ER, no nucleus. They are simple cells, and what you'll see is in the center region here, instead of a nucleus, this is just called the nucleoid region. Nucleoid. It's just kind of an area where you'll find the DNA. Then you'll see the soupy cytoplasm, and then you will see a cell wall here. This is your cell wall. And then attached to the cell wall, they have these little parts coming off. These are called pili. Actually, I think it's two L's. Pili. And they help the bacteria to stick to surfaces. And then you might see this long thing, which is called a flagella. I'll spell it over here. Flagella. And the flagella's job is to help the bacteria to swim around. So very, very simple structure, prokaryotic cells compared with eukaryotic cells. So those are all of your parts to plant cells, animal cells, and then looking at prokaryotic cells.